fluid identities and unstable ontological levels, David Lynch's film Mulholland Drive tends to frustrate many critics and viewers who wish to recuperate a coherent plot from it and comprehend its characters. It's quite informative to trace these reactions. They give strong indication of how critics wish for transcendent meaning and narrative logic. Critics such as Catherine Hales and Nicholas Gessler at UCLA have counted minutes, made charts of dream, reality, and flashback sequences, and then they have accounted for logical events and transforming characters in terms of these mapped-out ontologies. A more challenging reading is offered by our conference convener, Anna Powell. While keeping with the argument regarding the presence of a hierarchical ontological layering within the film, and thereby with the claim that some characters do not actually exist, she points to the affective resonances that echo between these layers. Thereby, she opens toward, but does not herself quite offer, a reading of the film that points specifically to the challenge Lynch offers Hollywood character models. This is the reading which I will propose here. What happens exactly if we approach Mulholland Drive not in order to force it into a presupposed mold of narrative and subjective coherence, but in order to affirm the possibilities it offers of thinking otherwise? Typically, Hollywood representations of subjectivity are intimately intertwined with temporality in that they are based on a Hegelian notion of the subject as a continuous entity unfolding through time. It's fair to state that, even when they are post-war productions, Hollywood's films still do not frequently make use of what Deleuze has identified as the unique potential of the image. As an audiovisual practice, he notes, the cinematic image has the capacity to capture time in a variety of constellations. With the possibility of creating differential relations between the visual and the sound image comes the potential of making perceptible temporal structures which cannot be reduced to the object of representation or to the present. In this paper, I point to how Lynch does make use of this possibility of the image and thereby opens toward thinking of the subject beyond the striations of Hollywood temporality and continuity. As I will show, Lynch's Mulholland Drive works quite poignantly with disjunctive relations between visual and sound images. I will look in my two main examples. I will look at how Lynch plays first with the visual and then the sound image to explode the subject as a coherent construct. Thereby, it becomes possible for me to argue that Mulholland Drive breaks with the coherent temporality of subjectivity and makes it possible to envisage characters not as subjects, but as events. Visually, then, the film unsettles an ontological stability by putting at play a number of visual relationships that exceeds and complicates the narrative image. Most centrally, this can be seen if we look at how the lead protagonists are set up through disjunctive doubling of identities and realities. This doubling traverses the boundaries between the different, seemingly incompatible ontological levels of the film. In each part, we have a Betty, a Diane, a Rita, and a Camilla. And to add to the confusion, we have the actresses Naomi Watts and Laura Elena Harding appearing as Betty Diane and Rita Camilla, respectively. Lynch's way of working with visual doubling, and he did this also, as you might remember, in Twin Peaks and also in Lost Highway, enables him to create characters that are connected through a visual temporal relationship exceeding that of the action, or what Deleuze would call the sensory motor schema. This visual temporal relationship is not a succession of time, but a set of durations established by affective associations. This is what confuses many viewers, as it becomes difficult to account both for time and identities. In Mulholland Drive, this state is reinforced by the fact that there is not only a visual juxtaposition between Betty and Rita and Diane and Camilla, and the appearance duplication of Betty, Diane, and Rita Camilla. Did I repeat myself? Anyway, it's supposed to be the other way around. But also there's a doubling of personal names. This lack of grounding and stable relations between name and identity can be seen if we pay attention to how these names appear and their role in relation to character. The names of the protagonists then, Betty, Diane, Rita, and Camilla, are all offered to us as printed statements attached to their bearers, like appendages, much like mine, obviously, so you all know I'm definitely Frida Beckman, or maybe you don't because you're Deleuzians, like me. The names Betty and Diane, both at different times, appear on the name of the same waitress at a Winkies cafe. The name Rita is picked up from a film poster featuring Rita Hayworth as Gilda, and the name Camilla we see printed on an actress's photograph. This visualization of all the central names in the film is in fact a powerful way of releasing the name from its role as a denotation of identity. Instead, the name becomes a visual surface play between two levels of the image. I have pointed out already the already confused visual associations produced by the doubled actresses, and with the printed names, the visual image is containing at least a double message. In fact, the visual image points to different sheets of time, as the names we see repeatedly point to events that are yet to come. One example of this is the name tag spelling Diane at Winkies. The name Diane, then, as I've already indicated, is carried literally on a name tag by a dark blonde waitress at the Winkies cafe where Rita and Betty have a cup of coffee. Much attention is given to this name. Betty pronounces it specifically when thanking the waitress, and there's a close-up on the name tag after it seems to affect Rita. Suffering from amnesia after a car crash, Rita is searching for her own identity. And this name tag makes her remember something. Diane Selwyn. Maybe that's my name. This possible sense of identification for Rita with the name of Diane Selwyn also explains her fear and panic when discovering Diane Selwyn's dead body. The long dark hair of this corpse does indeed associate it visually with Rita rather than Diane. In the meantime, the hair of the waitress bears its most obvious resemblance to Diane's, that's Naomi Watts' character's slightly darker, less radiant hair. This is, accordingly, a dual movement where the name Diane suggests a link between Rita and Diane, while at the same time foreshadowing the visual identification of Betty and Diane. The role of the name tag Diane, then, could be read not so much to denote the identity of its bearer, but to set in motion the journey of Betty and Rita towards indiscernibility. In the latter part of the film, the same waitress is shown, this time carrying a name tag spelling Betty. And just as the names Rita and Camilla Rhodes release themselves from their context and make new connections, the two name tags of the Winkies waitresses in turn connect to the blonde. In the beginning, Rita picks up, as I've already mentioned, her name from the Gilda film poster, becoming Rita as she does so. The name of Camilla Rhodes in the first part of the film is attached to the picture of a blonde woman, the girl, who is selected as the lead actress for director Adam Kesher's new film production. This is a blonde woman without any visual similarities or connotation either to Betty or Rita. We first see her photograph at a director's meeting, and also she's performing at the audition where Adam is induced to declare that she is the girl. Accordingly, the bearer of the name Camilla Rhodes is connected with a successful actress. Camilla Rhodes is in fact a virtual possibility for both Betty and Rita. In the first part of the film, Betty's very promising talent and contact seem to indicate that she is moving towards this possibility. But as it turns out, Rita will actualize this role and become a successful actress with the name Camilla Rhodes. These movements give the names the sense of being verbs. The names denote a being. No, they denote a doing, not a being. And this doing is not necessarily connected with a particular subject. Diane, Betty, Rita, and Camilla are not the names of temporal subjects moving and developing through narrative. Rather, they are naming events, or naming events, denoting what Deleuze has called the reciprocal presupposition or reversibility of virtual and actual possibilities. Because these reversals make character into actualizations of names at the same time as they become virtual possibilities of them, these characters exist in a temporality that cannot be accounted for in terms of succession, but must be understood as a layering of time, as a co-presence of past and future. If the visual image discussed here in terms of visual identity and the visualizations of names could be seen as an illustration of how the film offers characters as events rather than subjects, the same thing can also be said by the way characters are portrayed in relation to sound. More precisely, I will give two brief examples of how Lynch works with the soundtrack to layer reality and subjectivity in a crystalline image. There is a central scene in Mulholland Drive taking place at the theater called Club Silencio. There, in the middle of the night, Betty and Rita watch a bizarre show where performance and performances are separated. The sound is severed from the musicians and singers which visually appear to be producing it. But as the sound continues, after the trumpet player stops playing and after the singer stops singing, we realize that this relationship is the opposite. The sound does not originate from the performance, but rather the performance come to be through sound. Instead of a subject and its enunciation, this scene portrays the subject as a virtuality actualized through sound. The most powerful example of this within this scene is the performance of Rebecca Del Rio. In this scene, then, an exorbitantly made-up singer collapses on the stage while her powerful voice uninterruptedly continues to fill the hall of the theater. There is no band. Music can be summoned and silenced at the flick of a finger. Voices are disconnected from the bodies through which we presume they were emanating. I would have loved to show this clip to you. It's really beautiful, but I'm too busy spending time talking myself. So, Rebecca Del Rio's made-up face seems like a grotesque mask, as if the face is lifting from itself. A small artificial tear is attached to the corner of her eye, as if the emotional expression is applied externally. The high emphatic face of Rebecca seems completely emotionally involved in the singing. But despite this seeming commitment to the emotion of the song does not emanate from her body, but exists outside it. Rebecca is only miming. This becomes clear as she collapses on the stage while the voice, as I said, continues to fill the theater. Even as two men enter the stage and carry, or rather drag, her apparently lifeless body out, the highly emotional voice endures. This cut between the visual and the sound image realizes a break between expression and subjectivity and creates instead a sense of the subject as temporarily constructed through sound. There is no sustainable link between the sound and the visual image, and with this cut it becomes impossible to construct or even imagine a continual temporal subject. The temporality of the subject, if indeed we can still call it a subject, can be seen only in the crystal image. The singer becomes a virtual possibility of the song, actualized for a little while through the event. This argument can be fortified if we explore the status of Rebecca outside the song. As she walks up to the microphone, her face is utterly motionless and in complete opposition to the emotion which it will be sparked into by the song. Her strong expression is thus framed between states of blankness, the end of it, as I've already mentioned, is being her collapse. The visual image offers Rebecca as a subject of expression only at the cue of the sound image. This entails that the split between the subject and enunciation becomes not a split, but a reversal. Until it's ignited by the voice, the subject appears as a mere potentiality. As the concierge so proudly announces in the beginning of the show, "No hay banda, il n'y a pas des orchestres." There is no band, it is all recorded. And indeed, there is no one playing or singing here, no subject of enunciation. It's all a tape. The voice inevitably comes from the outside. Without a pre-existing subject, the event rises to the surface and overrides the temporality in which the subject could exist. I will use my last example now to show how Lynch could be said to push characters even further over the edge into the desubjectified pool of virtual and actual. Toward the very end of the film, Diane sits staring at a blue key on a table. This is the key, incidentally, which is the sign that her contracted murder on Camilla has been executed. There's a loud knocking on the door, and miniature versions of an old couple we have seen briefly at the very beginning of the film creep under her door. They will push Diane to suicide by chasing her into a panic, but the crucial point here is that the soundtrack anticipates Diane and her actions. Diane's screams of horror can be heard before the fatal chase begins, as if it's already happening before we can see it. Putting the visual and the sound image out of sync like this, the reality of the present is being just slightly pulled apart, as if it's haunted by the actual and the virtual simultaneously. Deleuze and Guattari have shown how sound, and in particular the voice, can provide a possibility of freeing the self from the self. The voice, as they write in Thousand Plateaus, is far ahead of the face, very far ahead. In this scene, we can see how the sound, rather than functioning as a mere reflector of the visual image, introduces a gap in the self, a deterritorialization of self and voice. It is opening the impossible present toward becoming, toward what Deleuze describes as the paradox of infinite identity, of future and past, of more and less, of too much and not enough. There are no stable foundations or identities on which difference can be established, no base in relation to which we can identify which is the disjunctive element in the scene. With reality torn apart like this, transcendence becomes impossible. Diane here can't be accounted for in relation to an overarching temporality, but is completely part of the virtual and actual play of the event. The event here, the screaming voice, the terror, the figure of the Diane, shows a matrix of exteriority in which no singular element can be identified as origin or agent. While the terror, it could be argued that the terror suggests a translation between inside and outside, the incessant movement between subject and object, cause and effect, make them impossible to identify. Just as the event is simultaneously marked by past, present, and future, Diane is part of all these moments concurrently, and as such, she couldn't possibly be seen as a stable unity, but as an illusion of the present. In this scene, we could not simply say that Diane is screaming, or that the terror has invested her. Rather, we can see how there is a screaming, a terror, a figure called Diane, which together produce a subjective effect, a Dianing of the scream and the terror. As I've tried to show in this paper, then, Mulholland Drive makes possible an alternative understanding of how components of the image relate to the construction of character. Both the visual and the sound image, as we have seen, become the territorializing forces that produce connections whose logic is not that of the real possible, or even of the virtual actual as independent states. The proliferation of virtual states, the names, the sounds, is so pervasive that it becomes hard to identify an actual at all. To put it in Deleuzian terms, these images absorb the entire actuality of the character. In fact, you could argue that the very mystery of Mulholland Drive lies in its complete collapse of the possibility of distinguishing between actual and virtual. In this context, the virtue of the film becomes its challenge to the traditional structure of subject-object, cause and effect. As my reading of the verbalization of names and the disengagement between sound and vision have shown, the event in Mulholland Drive places subject and object in the same verb. It's a joint happening from which neither can be dissociated. This way, the film could be said to amend the logic of reactivism, which, as Nietzsche argued, builds the notion of the subject through mistaking effect as cause. Lynch's major achievement, then, is not that of a superb capacity of concealing the deeper and darker truths which would explain the irrational movements of his characters. On the contrary, the film makes use of cinema as a truly audiovisual technology to rethink Hollywood subjectivity. Deleuze notes that when the image becomes truly audiovisual like this, it doesn't burst into pieces, but it gains a new consistency, made possible through the complex relation between visual and sound. This consistency, as Deleuze's whole second cinema book shows, has immediate implications of how we can see time. Here I have tried to show how Lynch plays with the potential of the image to disrupt the idea of continuous temporality and offers a consistency quite his own. In the hands of David Lynch, then, cinema does indeed become the philosophical practice that Deleuze endorsed. Thank you.